Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Straw Hat Luffy, The Black Fist by J.R.R. Toast. What if Luffy had never eaten the devil fruit Shanks had brought into the bar that day? What if he started sailing a little earlier than canon? How would his story be different? Would he be the same Luffy we know and love? One thing is for sure, Luffy and his friends are in for a wild adventure. Adios.
Chapter 55. Bloody Nights, I'd like to see you try. Sanji hissed, eyes narrowed into slits as the rest of his body tensed. Back to normal or not, Mosshead was about to get the shit beat out of him. Steam blew from the corners of Zoro's mouth and he lifted the two blades in his hands above his head, pointed in the opposite direction of the one between his teeth. Hope you're happy with stew being the last meal you ever serve. He growled around Watto's wrappings, grip tightening on the katanas he held. Without another word, he ripped forward and violently slashed his swords through the air, 108 caliber Phoenix. An undulating purple beam shot in the chef's direction and his body moved on instinct, feet pushing him off to the right. Steel consumed his vision as the light cut through the trees at his back and he dropped to his knees, skidding through the grass. He saw his eyes reflected in the flat of the blade when it grazed the tips of his hair but paid it no mind and shot from the ground, flipping backward to slam his leg into the Verde's shoulder, smoked Apol. The swordsman growled animalistically up at his opponent and used every bit of his power to enhance his right shoulder, a smoking black foot striking him in the exact spot. Cracks ripped through the ground underneath him and he grimaced, still feeling the weight of the attack through the invisible armor. Kaguya shot out in the blink of an eye and even though he hadn't quite been able to wound him with the strike, the cook was still within range. He let the haky coalesce in his shoulder flow once again and guided it to the blade's hilt, smirking when his arm finished fully extending, shimmer. Sanji's eyes widened when it looked like small granules of something shot up the katana's steel and gathered in the tip. He probably wouldn't have even noticed if his senses weren't dialed up so high at the moment. A flash of light suddenly stole his sight and the only thing that stopped him from being maimed irreparably by the next attack was the small tingle that fluttered across the entirety of his skin. There was danger, everywhere. Dancing lights, the sheening of steel echoed all around the blonde and he rapidly stepped backward, a grunt leaving him when he realized he was a moment too slow. A three-dimensional latticework of purple slashes suddenly appeared at his front and he dove forward, hissing when blood began to drip from the 4 or so large cuts now marring the black fabric of his suit. He tore his gaze away from the crimson soaking into his sleeves with a scowl and rolled back to his feet, steps quickening to put more distance between him and his adversary. However, it seemed his crewmate didn't want him going too far. "Divider!" Zoro roared, wrenching his blades inward without stopping his forward movement. Two more air blades left the katanas and for a moment Sanji couldn't figure out why they were so off target. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The arcs suddenly curved inward and would have crashed into him if he weren't so quick on his feet, their impact sounding like metal when they met each other at his back. He kept his sight set on his target, despite the numerous attacks heading his way, and his steps turned into leaps, only needing 2 or 3 to find himself back in his opponent's range. The chef's legs struck out with blinding ferocity in an attempt to leave Mosshead no room to retaliate, but the swordsman took a page from his book and, after deflecting the majority of the blows, shot back to give himself room to breathe. He gave chase and feigned a leap into the air, sprinting into the other boy's personal space as a flying slash consumed the space above his head. Rips found their way into Sanji's pant legs as they crashed against metal over and over again, but the few attacks that made it through the Verde's guard had him smiling like a madman. It was strange though, it didn't feel like he was doing much damage. It was honestly a miracle he hadn't lost a body part yet, probably only due to his keen awareness of the blade's edges and the danger they carried. Even so, his eyes burned with determination as his kicks struck out with unrelenting speed, katanas dancing in response while each clash of steel and flesh echoed through the forest. The blonde deflected a swipe at his collarbone and flipped over Zoro's head, black boot striking out like a viper. The shoe's point dug into his adversary's back and he smirked when he felt soft flesh instead of the hardened variety, smoked Ronyan. The swordsman snarled when it felt like his right kidney practically exploded and his body lifted from the ground. His hand shot downward when he found himself flying out of yet another cloud of smoke, and he pushed himself off the grass before shakily landing on his feet. He lifted his shirt and growled at the large purple mark taking up the majority of his right side, already dropping it to grip his blades even tighter than before. He hadn't been quick enough in moving his enhancement and had paid the price. Zoro's breathing was hard for the fight, having only lasted a few minutes, but his use of haky was costing him. Not to the point of exhaustion, but he could definitely feel the drain on his stamina. Two katanas suddenly came up in an X and caught a leg rocketing in his direction, a growl leaving his mouth when he shoved the cook away. He launched Kitetsu toward the sky and shot into the air right on its tail, hand snaking out to grab it like an ice pick. His body began to fall and he let the rushing wind push him parallel to the ground. Equinox! He roared, ripping his body into a tight spin. Sanji's feet hit the grass and he moved so fast that his eviscerated suit jacket shredded itself off his body, the remains being bisected by a razor-sharp blade of air. The circular slash sheared through the earth, leaving a large gouge behind before dissipating, and he skid to a stop as the grinding sound echoed off into the distance. He looked down at his tattered blue sleeves and ripped them off just as his opponent landed in front of him, the wind blowing them somewhere into the forest. "I can do this all night, Mosshead." The swordsman smirked and pointed Kaguya at what remained of the cook's outfit. "Your clothes are calling you a liar." His grin widened at the anger the comment garnered. "Soon enough you won't just be a pervert, you'll be a streaker too." He bared his teeth animalistically and his katanas flashed to his sides when a roar came from the boy standing opposite of him. Their battle resumed and sent shockwaves through the ground, uprooting grass and scattering dirt in every direction. The fury of the clashes so far had Zoro almost completely forgetting about the anger he'd felt earlier, and a bloodthirsty grin plastered itself onto his face. It was the first time he'd gotten to really face off against the blonde, and he couldn't help but be surprised. "You're really not that bad, Cook," he grunted, deflecting a particularly vicious kick aimed at his head, "but you're gonna have to do better than that if you don't want to die." Sanji could feel some of the bloodlust emanating from his opponent seep into him, and his foot connected with Zoro's guard before he sent himself into a powerful spin. "Don't worry, Mosshead." The outside of his leg slammed into the flat of a blade, smoke exploding around their forms, and the opposite appendage shot at the swordsman's hip just before it disappeared from his vision. "I'm just getting started." Currently blind, the Verde hissed when he felt weight push against his right side and his body shot out of the white cloud like it was fired from a cannon, rag-dolling figure slamming against the ground and rolling. His arms curled to cover his head and it only took moments for him to get back to his feet, momentum causing him to slide a few more yards. "Santoryu!" The smile disappeared from Zoro's face and he almost immediately bent at the knee, Kaguya and Kitetsu vibrating in his white-knuckled grip. He wanted to see how much the damn pervert could. He's pointing toward the sky. He grit his teeth and launched himself back into the fray, the ground shattering underneath his feet. His blades twinkled in the moonlight as he practically glided forward and, with one final step, his katanas struck outward, glimmers of light consuming the area all around the two, shimmering demon cut. The blonde managed to dodge the initial strike, but when he turned to retaliate, the air itself suddenly seemed like it began to shine. What the hell? Without an inkling as to what was going on, he ignored it, and the only thing that told him it was the wrong decision was the tingle that once again spread across his skin. Shit, he didn't know exactly what the feeling was, but it was screaming at him that he'd messed up. The area flashed white again, but the light was accompanied by the sound of ringing steel this time, and Sanji growled loudly at the pain that covered him from head to toe, blood splashing against the ground from the multitude of cuts now marring his body. He grit his teeth through the pain and jumped out of the danger zone, red rain falling from his retreating figure. Zoro watched the chef land and couldn't help the small bit of satisfaction that rushed through him at the sight of his bloodied opponent. Damn Cook had gotten what he deserved. He couldn't help but be slightly disappointed though, he'd expected a little more. With his anger mostly cooled at the outcome of their clash, the Verde began to sheathe his katanas before looking up to his crewmate's unmoving form. "We're done. I don't want to piss Luffy off by actually killing you." The thought caused a slight shiver to run down his spine and he quickly shook it away. He had no delusions about making it out of that fight alive now that he could use haky again. He could barely keep up when he couldn't. Sanji hadn't moved an inch since he'd landed. He couldn't take his eyes away from the blood seeping through the rips covering his blue shirt, and the sight made him feel one thing more than any other. Anger. He didn't care about the pain. He didn't care about his ruined clothes. The only thing that mattered was paying the swordsman back in kind. However, he couldn't figure out how, and it was only making the feeling grow hotter. The damn piece of grass was stronger than him. A sharp pang shot through the chef's stomach, and it felt like his whole body clenched. For all the attacks he'd landed, Mosshead didn't look anywhere close to as injured as he was. How the hell was he making his skin so hard? He'd felt it with almost every clash he'd won. It was almost like kicking a brick wall. Cook? The swordsman questioned, hand hovering over Kaguya and Kitetsu while the other still firmly held Wado. He was unable to see his eyes from beneath the shadow of his blonde hair and could practically feel the tenseness still consuming the area. He slowly drew his blades once again and placed Wado back in his mouth. For some reason, it felt like maybe things weren't as finished as he thought they were. Sanji didn't reply and continued to stare down at the bloody ground beneath him. The heat settled in his stomach, beginning to rise in temperature. He reached into his pocket and grasped the somehow still intact box of cigarettes that rested there. Tap. The heat started to swirl, and for a moment the chef felt like he was going to throw up. He was so angry. No, not anger. Clarity suddenly found him when his hand wrapped around the lighter in his other pocket. He simply wanted to win. He wanted to beat Mosshead so bad that he never challenged him again. Tap. Sanji brought the lighter up and gave it a flick, flame licking into existence and searing the end of the white stick now in his mouth. With a deep inhale and the closing of his eyes, he felt the swirling heat move downward alongside the nicotine, finding its way into his bloodstream. Something was in motion. He could feel it. He just had to follow it. This desire to win, this need to win. In the moment, it may have been the strongest emotion he'd ever felt. Tap. Smoke exploded out of the blonde's leg, but he made no movement as he intently followed the heat that continued to move downward. More. The lava inching through his body reached his hip before it seemed to rapidly drop and coalesce in his right foot. Hotter. The temperature skyrocketed when the heat reached its destination, and the flow of smoke rising from his legs suddenly stopped. Tap. A small pop sounded near the ground, and, still, Sanji didn't open his eyes. More. He didn't know what he pushed on, but push on it he did. And another pop sounded right after the first. He could feel the temperature of his foot still rising and innately began to compress it with no real knowledge of what he was actually doing. It just felt right. Tap. Zoro eyed the cook's leg as it seemingly began to spark. What the hell was that? He watched the black boots tapping grow faster and the small flashes rise in frequency. It took him a moment, but his eyes suddenly widened. He'd seen something similar before, in his own katanas no less, but if the cook was somehow using enhancement, how could he see it? Was it something else? Surely he couldn't have unlocked haky through a spar, right? The chef's blue-gray orbs suddenly snapped open, the temperature consuming his foot popping out of existence, and yet, not. There was still a heat there, but it was more refined from the coolness now surrounding the skin of his leg. Pops continued to sound, and he looked down to find a multitude of wispy smoke strings rising from small holes in his pants. The more he compressed the heat, the more pops sounded until it rose to a cacophony of small explosions, leg flashing like he had firecrackers underneath his skin. Sanji's bloodied gaze narrowed and lifted to meet the swordsman standing opposite of him, sparking toes curling into the quickly deteriorating sole of his shoe. You're fucking dead. Luffy, we need to leave. Now? Vivi argued angrily to the boy, paying her absolutely zero attention. Their long journey through the forest had been an arduous one, filled with fear at the thought of something attacking them in the dark, but the princess and her duck had finally found their two missing companions. It had been a shock to come upon them arm-resting giants in the middle of their campsite, but the feeling had been quickly overcome by irritation. She didn't have time for them to be playing around. Rushed. Introductions were had, and she'd been able to officially meet who she now knew was named Brogy, as well as his dueling partner, Dory. Stay, small girl, Brogy bellowed, laughing while slamming the back of Luffy's hand, and the rest of his body, into the dirt for what felt like the 100th time that night. Any friend of these two is a friend of ours. Damn it, Luffy growled, wiping the dirt from his clothes and pulling himself from the small crater he rested in. He made it back to his feet and shot the giant a perturbed eye, fist clenching as he readied for another bout. "One more, Brogy, I'm gonna win this time." Usopp sighed at the laughter that rose from the large man's throat. He'd kept to watching because he didn't want to die. He shook his head and turned to the blue-haired girl when the two began another match, sending her an apologetic shrug. "I'm gonna be honest, Vivi. There's not much you can say to make him leave until he wins at least once." It had been a shock to see someone as physically capable as Luffy lose so many battles of strength, but, honestly, it had only made his reverence for the giants grow. Another boom sounded through the clearing and dust erupted around Luffy's figure once again, Vivi's teeth gritting angrily while she watched him groan. "We don't have time for you to be playing around, Luffy," she argued. When her words were lost to the wind, she went to approach but stopped herself as the sound of pounding footsteps came from the tree line at her back. Usopp rose from his sitting position and grabbed his slingshot from his bag, immediately into its pouch. He only had to wait a moment before the source of the noises broke into the clearing and sighed in relief when it wasn't some large animal of the night like he'd thought. "Luffy!" Nami shouted as she and Ms. Sun rushed into the area, taking a moment to rest with her hands on her knees. She looked over her shoulder when her heartbeat began to slow and, even though it was quiet, could still hear signs of the fight they'd left behind. "It's Zoro and Sanji." Her words caught in her throat when she turned back and she gulped. Giants were way bigger up close. "Quite the party going on here, it seems." Ms. Sun chimed in, her breathing only slightly less heavy than the girl next to her. She looked around the campsite and the first things she examined were the two largest. It really was strange seeing giants again. "I see you've made some friends, Mr. Captain." She mused with a small laugh. It honestly came as no surprise that he'd somehow ingratiated himself with them. He'd managed with her after all. The straw-hatted teen looked away from his opponent before he could ask for another match and smiled excitedly at the two, turning back to introduce them to his new companions. "Dory, Brogy, this is my navigator, Nami, and..." He paused when he realized he didn't quite know what to call the woman at her side. "And this is Ms. Sun," he added, tentatively motioning to said woman, "our friend." Luffy smiled widely when the words got a nod from the woman. "She's got a really cool devil fruit that grows hands-on stuff." He watched the two approach the large fire in the middle of their campsite and a teasing smirk rose to his lips. Black orbs catching the blue of the bounty hunters, "But, I think she might be kinda dumb, she can't remember my name." "You wound me, Luffy." Ms. Sun replied in false pain, "I think you're the first man to ever call me dumb." Dory and Brogy chortled to each other as they watched the interaction and waved the newcomers over. "Come join us," the blue-caped giant exclaimed. "There's more than enough dinner to go around. Especially for one so small." He glanced at their savior and realized he needed to revise his statement, "Unless you eat like this captain of yours." "We don't have time for this," Vivi interjected vehemently, moving to grab Luffy so they could begin their trek back to the Mary. If she managed to get him to go, she figured the rest would follow. However, a hand wrapped around her wrist when she reached out and she glanced to the side to see Nami looking at her through narrowed eyes. "Shut up, Vivi," the Orangeit growled, practically throwing the princess over to Ms. Sun. The blue-haired girl stumbled and her duck quacked angrily in response but stopped quickly when he saw the look Nami shot in his direction, another meek whine leaving his beak before he quieted, "What the hell, nah." "I said shut up, Vivi," the navigator hissed, turning to stomp in the princess's direction. She stopped in front of her and poked the ex-bounty hunter in the chest angrily. "Do you realize how stupid of you it was to go running off by yourself?" She saw Vivi make to argue and her gaze darkened, the words seeming to catch in the other girl's throat. "Tell me, Vivi, can you fly?" she asked seriously, "or punch so hard you can shatter rock?" The princess tentatively shook her head in the negative and stayed quiet, seeing that the Orangeit was trying to make some kind of point. She wanted to get angry but the look on her face screamed what a bad idea that would be. "You could have died coming out here." Nami pointed at Ms. Sun standing behind her. "She warned us about how dangerous this place is and we even saw it for ourselves. Yet, for some stupid reason, you still decided to come out here all alone." Vivi couldn't take it anymore and shoved the Orangeit away, her face showing the anger she felt in her heart. "Don't you dare call my reason stupid. My country is in peril, nah." "What use are you to your country if you're dead?" Nami practically screamed. A huff left her mouth when she saw the vitriol in the blue-haired girl's eyes turn to shock. You're so focused on getting home that you're not even thinking about what would happen if you never make it. If she was being honest, she was mostly upset about almost losing her shot at a billion berries, but Vivi didn't need to know that. The princess visibly shrunk in on herself as the realization hit her. Even though it pained her to admit, Nami was right. She'd been so caught up in getting back that she hadn't even thought about what would happen to Alabasta if she never made it. Her eyes lifted from her feet and she scrambled to get any words out, unable to find a reply before the orange-haired girl turned away. Just can it, Vivi. What's done is done. Nami found Luffy watching the interaction awkwardly and sighed, nodding him in their direction. Come on Luffy, we gotta go. You need to stop Zoro and Sanji from killing each other, she said, turning back toward the forest. The pirate captain looked at her back questioningly as she walked in the direction of where she and Miss Sun had entered from. What? Zoro went berserk and Sanji stayed behind to make sure we didn't get hurt, Miss Sun provided without actually looking at the word's recipient. Nami sure could make someone feel small. She was glad she hadn't been on the receiving end of her words. Luffy froze in place and his eyes locked to the tree line. Zoro and Sanji are fighting? His reply was the nod of two heads and he almost immediately rocketed off toward the forest. Why the hell didn't you guys start with that? I wanna fight too. He looked over his shoulder before he disappeared into the thick foliage and waved everyone in his direction. Come on guys, or we'll miss it. Dory, Brogy, you should come too. The pirate captain's eyes flashed forward and he thought he could hear the faint signs of a struggle coming from somewhere up ahead. Let's make it an all-out brawl. Crickets and the crackling of the large fire were the only replies to the boys' words as the rest of the group stared at each other blankly before the quiet was broken by booming laughter. I think I'd like to see our savior's prowess in battle once again. Dory shouted jovially, turning to his friend sitting beside him. Come, Brogy, I think it's time we witness a duel besides our own. The words snapped the rest of those in the clearing back into action and Usopp sighed to himself while everyone else moved to follow Luffy into the dark forest. He caught a still passed out Mr. 3 resting against a tree on the other side of the campsite and couldn't help but think it wasn't a great idea to leave him behind. What if he woke up? His eyes stayed trained on the unmoving figure for a moment longer before he heard Nami call his name and once again resumed his steps. It would probably be fine. Luffy's feet carried him through the trees like his life depended on it, a massive grin resting on his lips at the thought of a three-way fight with his friends. They hadn't really gotten to challenge each other besides a few small-scale bouts on the merry, but now that they had enough room, the thought sent excitement rushing through his body and he had to resist the urge to shoot off into the sky. This was gonna be awesome. The sounds of the fight that had been getting louder as he approached suddenly stopped and, for a moment, he thought he might have missed his chance to join his crew members in their spar. However, as he slowed to a stop, a pout of disappointment beginning to take over his features, something strange caught his attention. It sounded like, popping? You're fucking dead. The words shocked Luffy back into action and he resumed his sprint through the trees, heartbeat rising when his pout was replaced with excitement once again. It looked like he hadn't missed the festivities after all. Wait guys. He yelled in the direction of the weird noises, don't kill each other without me. Zoro's head shifted toward that. He heard his captain's voice come from somewhere in the darkness, but a whisper from the opposite side of the small clearing was all it took for him to completely ignore it. Atancel. A loud crackling consumed the area and the swordsman just barely had time to get his katanas up, crossing them in a defensive X. It wasn't a moment too soon. A black leg with yellow sparks shooting off of it crashed into his guard, eyes widening at the force of the attack, and, before he could attempt to shove the cook away, a bright explosion erupted around the two. Luffy's feet skid to a stop and he had to shield his eyes from the brightness that consumed his vision, just barely opening them in time to see Zoro's form scream backward through the air. His sharp eyes caught smoke rising from what looked like multiple burn marks covering the skin of the Verde's chest and he winced when he watched his first mate's body literally explode an entire tree. The sound of ripping wood accompanied the boom echoing off in the distance and a loud angry groan came from somewhere in the depths of the forest as Zoro's rolling form came to a stop. He looked down at his chest from his prone position and scowled at finding nothing remaining of the top he'd been wearing. That prick, he'd liked that shirt. He wrenched himself up with a grunt and wiped away the soot that covered his skin. smoke still rising from his slightly blackened body. Whatever the idiot had just hit him with, it hurt. He thought he blocked it too. The swordsman's bloodthirsty grin returned when his eyes caught the blue-gray of the cook standing on one foot with the other still sparking and raised to receive retaliation. Kaguya and Kitetsu flashed to his sides, teeth gritting tightly on Wato's wrappings. Now things are getting interesting. The shattering of earth came from where Luffy knew Zoro was, and he didn't wait to watch his crew members' next clash. He wanted to be a part of it. What could he say? He was a sucker for a good fight. Before the Verde's form even came into view, he was on the move with a gray metallic sheen rising to cover both of his hands down to the wrist. Time to have some fun. M's Goldnoweek tried to keep her breathing as even as possible while she watched the group make their hasty exit from the campsite and didn't move until she was absolutely sure they were gone. She'd been worried when the long-nosed guy had looked at Mr. 3, but it seemed her luck won out. The sound of the lumbering giant's steps began to quiet, and the girl waited for a moment longer before letting out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Her heart was beating hard, really hard. She shook her head and cautiously made her way toward the large fire in the middle of the clearing, eyes glancing about for anything she may have missed. When she passed the massive gathering of burning logs, she couldn't help but revel in their warmth. Why did she feel so cold? The bounty hunter pulled her gaze away from the bright yellow heat and her sight landed on the somehow still unconscious form of Mr. 3. Just how hard had that guy hit him? Her steps hastened and she eventually made it to the man's side, hands coming up in an attempt to jostle him back to consciousness. "Come on, Mr. 3. Wake up," she desperately whispered. "I'm tired and I can feel myself shutting down." She hadn't slept in far too long and she was starting to feel the effects. No response came from her companion, so Ms. Goldenweek steeled herself, shutting her eyes tightly as her open palm rose up. Hopefully, this wouldn't be too loud. A small smack echoed through the clearing, followed by the sharp intake of breath, and she couldn't help the massive sigh of relief that left her as she fell backward to sit on the ground next to her slowly waking partner. "Ms. Goldenweek?" the man asked groggily. He shifted slightly and almost vomited from the pain racking the majority of his upper body and face. What the hell had happened to him? It took a moment, but the events of the day suddenly came rushing back to him and he sharply sat up, a loud hiss leaving his lips when he lifted his back from the ground. "Thank God," the younger of the two whispered to herself. She attempted to gather herself up but found that she was too weak to even move. She really needed a nap. "We need to get out of here, Mr. 3. she said, once again trying to make it back to her feet. "I don't know how long they'll be gone." Mr. 3 watched the girl struggle to lift herself from the ground and, even though it was agony itself, moved to help her stand. "Are you all right?" "Yeah," Ms. Goldenweek replied shakily, "just a little tired." She looked up at the man and tried to smile, the gesture coming out more like a grimace. "I've been at it ever since you got knocked out." The words made the man frown as he threw her arm over his shoulder, a hiss leaving his lips when her weight settled on him. "At what, exactly?" Her grimace finally morphed into something resembling a smile and the young girl's black eyes met her partner's. "Why, trying to rescue you, of course." Mr. 3's breath caught in his throat as they began to move. She'd worked herself into this state just trying to rescue him? The thought made his mouth go dry, emotion gathering behind his eyes while they slowly made their way into the forest. "You didn't have to do that," he replied guiltily. After working with her for so long, he liked to think they'd become something like family as well as partners, but, family or not, they were still bounty hunters and he never really thought she'd go this far for him. "I know Ms. Goldenweek's words faltered when she tripped over a branch and sent them both tumbling to the ground. A quiet howl leaving Mr. 3 when she landed on top of him. "I'm sorry, Mr. I told you to call me Galdino when it's just the two of us, Marianne." The man groaned while he slowly lifted her from his chest. "Or at least uncle or something. Mr. 3 is far too impersonal for how long we've known each other." The words got a smile from Miss Goldenweek despite how she was feeling, and she reached out a hand to help her companion back to his feet. "And I remember telling you that I wouldn't unless I could call you Gal." A groan rose from the man's lips, but he couldn't help the small smile that took residence there. Fine. Gal it is, just don't say it around others," he countered, once again beginning to lead them through the forest. "It's embarrassing." The girl at his side suddenly stopped in place and he shot her a worried glance when he halted next to her. "Everything I really don't feel good, Gal," Marianne interrupted, breathing ragged even though they'd only walked a short distance. Her legs felt like lead and taking another step was suddenly the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. Mr. 3 turned to face her and the moonlight peeking through the trees was just barely enough for him to be able to see how sickly she looked. He went to take a step in her direction when her body suddenly went limp. Panic rushing through his system at the sight of her dropping like a sack of potatoes. "Marianne!" Galdino shouted in alarm, just barely catching her before she would have crashed into the ground. The back of his hand pressed against her forehead as he held the small girl in his arms and he hissed at the heat he could feel coming off of her. He attempted to wake her with a few light taps to the cheek but nothing seemed to be working and it only made his panic grow. This didn't seem like exhaustion. He was no doctor but knowing the dangers of this island, he feared the worst. The man lifted Miss Goldenweek into his arms, ignoring the pain racking his body, and desperately looked around for anything that might help in the current situation. However, the only thing he could think of was to try and cool her down, which would be a problem because of the lack of water or ice around. His wax would be of no use either. In the moment he had no idea what to do and that frightened he maybe, but he cared for Marianne as her partner, and seeing her in this state was causing him anguish like he'd never felt before. As Mr. 3 desperately tried to think of a way to help, only one thing kept coming to mind, one thing that, if it were any other situation, he would absolutely refuse to do. But, as the saying goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. Without another thought he turned back in the direction they'd come from and a single word left his lips over and over as he sprinted back through the forest despite the pain that racked him with every step. Help! Chapter 56, Three-Way. Zoro's eyes locked to his opponents as he pulled himself out of the dirt, katanas vibrating wildly in response to the bloodlust flowing through his system. The cool air of the night made the hair on his exposed chest rise and his grimace of pain turned into a grin. With black soot covering the majority of his body, he let his weight settle into his feet and crouched in preparation to launch himself back into the clearing. Santoryu. The swordsman growled to himself. Time to fight fire with fire. A crack echoed through the night and trees blurred by his form, body flashing forward like a beam of purple light through the depths of the dark forest. He broke back into the clearing and his grin widened at the sparking leg shooting out to receive his attack, blood drag. Sun Palm. Luffy screamed in joy, his smaller figure sliding to a stop between the two fighters right before Zoro would have struck outward with his blades. His smile grew at the widening of his friend's eyes and he slammed his darkened hand into the ground before either of their attacks could collide with him. Scorched earth. His hardened skin connected with the dirt and cracks ripped out from the point of impact in a circular wave. A loud boom accompanying the dust and debris that shot into the air around his form. Before Sanji even had the chance to figure out what was going on, cracks split into existence at his feet and he looked down to find brightness entering his vision. In a feat of pure athleticism, he pushed off his sparking leg and shot in the opposite direction, just barely outpacing the destruction chasing him down. Instead of following through with his original attack, Zoro turned Kaguya and Kitetsu so the flat of each katana faced the quickly deteriorating ground below. Before the wave could reach him, his swords flashed downward and the wind that rebounded off the rippling earth sent him screaming into the sky in the same direction as the cook. His body flipped through the air and he roughly landed right next to the person he'd been fighting only moments ago, both pairs of eyes wide as they took in the damage their captain's initial strike had caused. Another boom ripped through the clearing and the only thing either of the two rivals saw before Luffy's blindingly bright smile appeared before them was a blur of red. Twin impact. The straw-hatted pirate captain roared, palms finding the centers of his crew members' chests. His arms extended fully and he felt their skeletons compress underneath the blows, bodies folding in half. Two more shockwaves rocked the night and the forms of his opponents screeched backward, wood shattering when they smashed through the tree line. For those watching from afar, the moonlight seemed to drape Luffy in a captain's cloak of ethereal silver as he slid to a stop and clenched his hardened fist tightly in the direction of the two he'd sent flying, muscles tensing while he waited for his friend's retaliation. Holy shit. The princess's words were drowned out by the loud laughter that left the large head right next to her and she stumbled in shock. Wide eyes catching the trees far below, she knew this was a bad idea. Just before the scream building up behind her lips could be released, she stilled and the noise caught in her throat instead. Careful, princess. Ms. Sun chided as she helped the girl regain her balance. I would hate to have to help clean up your splattered remains. She turned back and had to keep herself from laughing at the paleness that took over Vivi's face, dropping her hands when the damsel in distress was safe once again. She really couldn't disagree with the words, though. Her eyes locked back to the small clearing they stood a short way away from and settled on the enigma that was Straw Hat Luffy. Holy shit, indeed. Over already? Dory bellowed in consternation, Usopp parroting his anger from his place on the giant's shoulder. Brogy and I provided far better entertainment. Nah, just give him a second. Nami sighed tiredly, laying on her side just in front of Ms. Sun and Vivi. It'll take more than that, I'm sure. She'd seen those three fight enough to know how strong they were. Well, not exactly how strong, but, still, she knew they wouldn't be done in by one hit. Two? Maybe, as if she'd spoken the words into existence. Two forms made their way back into the clearing and she couldn't help but agree with the whistle of appreciation that left Ms. Sun's mouth. Sanji's blue button-up shirt was completely gone and for someone who fought solely with his legs, he wasn't as lanky as the woman would have thought. However, as much as she wanted to admire his muscles, they were covered in what she assumed was blood. She had to squint to see the cuts with small streams of crimson leaking from them and was honestly shocked he was still kicking. Honestly, it was crazy that they'd managed to do this to each other in the short amount of time they'd been alone. Miss Sun shook her head and a matching whistle left her lips at the sight of the swordsman who looked very similar to the blonde next to him. His top was also nowhere to be found, seemingly blown off as far as she could tell, and he was covered in what looked like soot. Blood and dirt had smeared the black dust across the tan rippling musculature that covered his figure and, she could honestly say, it was really working for him. Nami unabashedly drank in the sight of the three boys' muscles and sighed wistfully. If only they weren't all complete idiots. She huffed aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. Miss Sun pulled her gaze from the clearing and shot the girl a teasing eye. I think you and I both know you don't give them enough credit. The orangeade went to give her rebuttal but stopped when it seemed the fight had resumed, a loud crack shooting through the air. Her eyes whipped to the clearing and she was just barely able to catch Luffy as his back slammed into one of the large pieces of debris uprooted by his previous attack. A disbelieving chuckle left her mouth when Nami watched him pull himself out of the rock and laugh before launching back in the direction of Zoro and Sanji. Hopefully, this wouldn't take too long. She glanced over at the blue-haired girl clinging to her frightened duck and had to resist the urge to scowl in irritation. The princess was bound to start getting pissy again and she was not in the mood to deal with it. Luffy skidded to a halt in front of his disheveled crew members and laughed loudly at their battered forms. You guys look terrible. No wonder you decided on a 2-on-1. The only reply to his words was a pair of growls and he threw his hands up in surrender, sending the two glaring boys a blank stare. Was it something I said? The sound of cracking earth was the answer he received and he immediately ducked, a very sharp sword missing the top of his skull by millimeters. The straw-hatted teen went to stand but found himself diving over a leg that was probably moving fast enough to chop him in two. He dipped his head forward when a tingle brushed across his neck and another sword came at his back, passing over him right before it hit the ground. Without a shred of hesitation, he twisted his core and his back slammed into the dirt. Eyes rising to find a sparking leg accompanied by three glittering swords all entering his vision at once. Uh-oh. Atancel, shimmering demon cut. A bare foot connected with Luffy's chest and his eyes widened when he felt how hard it was. Was that, before he could finish the thought, his vision was consumed by a bright explosion and his enhanced body cratered into the earth. The breath left his lungs when his back slammed into the ground and he just barely caught the glimmers of light now dotting the space around him as his body rebounded back into the air. The sound of the crackling explosion that came off of Sanji's leg was practically sliced to pieces by the hundreds of thin lines of light that all rang out at the same time. A flash lit the clearing as Aiz jumped away from the danger zone and landed roughly on their feet, deep breaths leaving both of their mouths while they waited for their vision to clear. You tryna blind me, mosshead? Sanji hissed through his teeth, resisting the urge to put his hands on his knees. He knew the second he let go of whatever it was he had going, he was done. Whatever was letting him make these explosions was also making him tired as shit. The swordsman only growled in response. He wasn't gonna lie, he'd been tired even before Luffy showed up. The cook's last attack had done some real damage. If it was just that, He probably would have been able to handle the exhaustion, but the amount of haky he was throwing around was really starting to catch up with him. "What the hell, Sanji?" Luffy exclaimed through an uncomfortable grunt, back colliding with the destroyed ground once again. However, it didn't stop him from immediately rising back to his feet, ignoring the slight shiver that ran down his spine when his vest fell to pieces around him. Why did he suddenly feel like a piece of meat? With the shake of his head, he was off, excitement already making his big smile return as his eyes settled on his blonde friend. "You didn't tell me you could use haky." The chef sighed at the mostly uninjured form of his captain. Sure, there were a few cuts and a big ol' footprint in the middle of his chest, but he looked very unbothered by the injuries. "I have no idea what the hell you're talking about," he answered honestly, ignoring the reply that came in favor of turning to the swordsman beside him. "I got about one more in me before this starts to get way less fun." He turned back to the boy happily jogging in their direction and his gaze narrowed. "You in?" No way was he gonna let the damn cook one-up him. Zoro's jaws tightened around Watto's hilt and he nodded slowly, loosening up as much as he could. "Don't you dare hold back." His black eyes flashed upward and met those of his captain. "I want to see him take everything we got." He ignored the strange look his crewmate sent him and flipped his grip on Kaguya, taking in a deep breath as the boy at his side shot into the sky. The Verde let the power pulsing inside of him beat alongside his heart and his toes curled into the soles of his barely still intact shoes. The heat swirled violently along with his desire to display his strength, and the katanas he wielded practically sang as they drank deeply of both. He wanted to show how far he'd come since the day he'd agreed to sail with his friend. "Peaks." He breathed out, lifting to hold his katanas vertically so each pointed at the other's hilt. "Peaks are places where one finds the height of their strength." The swordsman continued calmly, eyes locked to a very confused-looking Luffy, "and yet, they're momentary. Fleeting. Soon to be replaced by new peaks. Higher ones." He focused on the vibrating emanating from his katanas and carefully picked out their voices, a different colored flame appearing in his mind with the passing of each one. Purple for Kaguya, white for Watto, and black for Kitetsu. Guys?" Luffy questioned cautiously, legs slowing to a stop at Zoro's words. His eyes shot upward when it sounded like someone started setting firecrackers off in the sky, and he was met with the sight of Sanji's figure rapidly flipping in a storm of bright explosions. He glanced back and forth between the two, and it didn't take long before his pupils turned to stars. His friends were so cool. His form tensed, but the smile never left his face as the pirate captain readied himself. "Gimme everything y'all got." He'd been working on trying to spread his hardening, and this seemed like a good opportunity to see how far he'd come. Hopefully, he didn't lose any body parts. The shiver that had taken over his body made it seem like they were going all out. The images in Zoro's mind became so clear that they began to superimpose themselves over his reality, and he breathed in once again, thin lines of flame crackling across the edge of each katana. "I will continue to reach new peaks and grow stronger every day." His muscles tensed and he felt the skin of his soles harden while the rest of his enhancement still resided in his swords, however. The Verde could feel his pulse fueling the katana's fire and gripped them even tighter. "In this moment, this is my peak." He growled through Watto's hilt, "Santoryu Ogi." Luffy's world flashed pitch black for a moment and, in the darkness, 3 lines of colored flame materialized before his very eyes. By the time he lifted his hardened palm in defense, the flames had come to a point and they ruthlessly slammed into him, arm almost immediately buckling from the pure force. The area at his front shattered into thousands of tiny pieces as the tricolored light lit the clearing, his hardening screaming under the weight of the impact. "Zenith." The straw-hatted teen's eyes widened when he felt the metallic-like skin covering his palm begin to give, and he went to condense his haky even further. However, before he got the chance, something like a thundercrack shot through the air and distracted him. The momentary lapse in concentration was enough to make his guard falter, and the only thing that kept him from being maimed irreparably was his proficiency in moving haky around his body. Dark gray sprouted onto Luffy's chest and, as he was forced off his feet, he looked up to find Sanji blurring through the air. Small explosions ripping off the leg pointed in his direction. For the first time in a while, he really pushed his haky to its absolute limits and felt it expand in accordance with his will. He'd definitely gotten better, and it was time to see how much better. It wasn't easy, and the boy could feel the immediate strain on his stamina at the use of so much energy, but it was fast. The top half of his body flashed orange, then red, and then cooled to a gray just as Sanji's exploding foot cratered into his ribs. Étincelle du diable. Luffy's vision was consumed with a brilliant light and the ground at his back didn't just explode when he crashed into it. No, the earth below flashed into thousands of small cubes before disintegrating into non-existence under the might of the two attacks. His roar of defiance lost to the echoing claps of multicolored flame consuming his figure entirely. The onlookers watching from afar marveled at the pillar of multicolored fire that erupted into the air, half dominated by bright yellow and the other by purple, white, and black. It wasn't until the shockwave rolled over them that they understood the magnitude of what had just occurred, winds battering them as they held their ringing ears. Neither Dory nor Brogy moved an inch under the force that smashed into them, but they did send each other an appreciative nod as they watched the pillars slowly die down and turn to smoke. For normal humans, they were quite entertaining. Laughter suddenly began to erupt from their mouths and they started to clap, Brogy's hands cupping around his lips to make his excitement known. However, the red-caped giant stopped himself when he caught a figure shooting out of the large cloud of smoke, a small shockwave dispersing it off into the forest. "Oh my," he mumbled to himself as he got a closer look at the form rising higher into the sky. "Seems as if we're getting a real show tonight, ladies," Miss Sun teased. A smirk rose to her lips when she turned to the blue-haired girl off to her side and saw her blushing madly. "A first for you, princess?" The laughs came fully when Vivi ripped her eyes away from Luffy's body and buried her face into Karu's neck. "Oh, don't tease her," Nami chimed in, pulling her gaze away from a sight she'd seen on more than one occasion. "She just hasn't been on the ship long enough. Neither have you for that matter." She gave her captain an appreciative glance over her shoulder before turning back to the woman she was speaking to. "You'd be surprised how often he loses his pants." The soul of Luffy's bare fare once again and he shot higher into the sky, taking a moment to figure out why he felt so breezy. When he glanced down, he found his chest dotted with several dark purple bruises and a single deep cut that managed to make it through all of his protections, but, other than that, he seemed relatively normal. When he glanced further downward, however, he suddenly realized why he felt more free than usual, because he was. The only two items left intact on the teen's body were his necklace and his hat. Every other piece of clothing was gone. The only thing keeping him modest, so to speak, was the black soot covering him in darkness from the waist down. Although, it was pretty windy up there, the thought made him loudly laugh and he turned to face the ground, foot striking out sharply to reverse his direction. He could worry about pants after he paid his friends back for their awesome attacks. Sun Palm. A sigh left Zoro's lips as he took Watto out of his mouth, fingers rubbing at the corners of his eyes tiredly. "He's naked again, isn't he?" Sanji's answer was a loud groan and he began furiously rubbing his hands over his face like he was trying to wash away the image he'd just been met with. "Yep." The two reluctantly looked up when their worlds flashed a bright white and the swordsman sighed again, deeper this time, as his vision met a pure black diamond, cross-shaped light fluctuating rapidly in the sky. "Well, this is just Ember." Black Star. Very aware of the coming pain and what it would mean for their futures, Zoro and Sanji raised their defenses as quickly as they could. And waited, and waited, and waited. "Did you guys hear that?" Luffy asked, his head popping up between the two still looking up to the sky. Startled yelps left his crew members' mouths and he looked at them weirdly. Why were they so jumpy? "Put some damn clothes on before you get so close to me like that," the chef yelled angrily, bending down to rub dirt over any place he thought his captain may have touched him. A growl left Zoro's lips and he sheathed his three katanas. "What the hell are you talking about, Luffy?" He approached his captain, ripping a shred of cloth from what was left of his pants, and offered it to him when he stopped next to the other boy. "For your modesty." Luffy went to grab the covering in thanks but stopped himself. He shot his first mate a look that said, "Really?" and held his pinky up, finding it to be larger than the piece of cloth. His black orbs met a similar pair and the two stared at each other for a tense moment before chuckles suddenly began to rumble from both their chests. "Help!" The yell brought them out of their laughter and the two looked at each other before glancing over to Sanji. They all nodded in unison and rushed in the direction of the voice, uncaring of their various states of undress. Before any of them could make it out of the clearing, however, a man carrying a small girl broke through the tree line in a panic. "Help!" It wasn't soon after the words left his mouth that Mr. 3 realized who it was he was asking, but he didn't care. Please. She needs help. As the three approached, he suddenly became aware of the fact that the one at the front, who was also the one that had attacked him earlier, was completely naked, almost as if his attitude had rotated 180 degrees. He turned on his heel and sprinted as quickly as he could back toward the forest. She doesn't need help from perverts. Hey, I am not a pervert, Luffy argued, fingers pointing at his crew members accusingly while they chased after the two newcomers. They're the ones that blew my clothes off. Just when he went to speed up and cut them off from escaping back into the forest, a large shadow did it for him. The naked boy stopped on a dime when a massive foot cratered into the ground at his front and shot past the two boys who stilled beside him. As he stepped out into the open, his eyes caught the strange man cowering underneath the shadow of the large fist booming in his direction. Luffy's eyes widened and hardening sprouted on his feet to cover them like a pair of shoes. In what would seem like the blink of an eye to most, his darkened foot flexed, and shattered rock appeared where his body had been only moments ago. He flipped forward and pointed his hardened toes at his target, little girl alert. Just before what Mr. 3 thought was surely his and Marianne's deaths, he saw something so profound that, when asked about what happened later, he wouldn't be able to recall. The only thing keeping the sight from becoming a reoccurring nightmare was the fact that he and Marianne were somehow still alive. Dory growled when his strike was thrown off course, a small boom sounding up to the small one on his shoulder when his captain impacted against his wrist. He glared down at the boy who'd stopped him from ending the man that had tried to take advantage of his sacred duel, and the brat actually had the gall to glare back. He's got a little girl with him, Luffy yelled before his eyes came back down to the man cowering on the ground beside him, and they stayed there for a long moment, probably some kinda perv. I'm not the one naked, Galdino replied incredulously, the boy's companion sliding to a stop beside him. He kinda has a point there, Luffy. Zoro chuckled while trying to get a closer look at the two on the ground. He knew his captain wasn't actually a pervert, unlike the cook, but it wasn't a great look. Yeah. Whatever. The straw-hatted teen waved the words away and turned to address the now calmer giant once again. You alright now? He smiled at the nodding of the Dory's head. I saw you guys watching. What did you think? Just as the large man went to answer, Brogy arrived in the clearing carrying his group of little ones in his hand rather than them riding on his shoulder. Without a word, he kneeled and set the ladies on the ground, each of them gingerly stepping back onto solid land and making their way in the direction of the commotion. Before he could rise again, however, the raven-haired one grabbed his attention. Brogy, would you mind lending me a piece of your cape? Ms. Sun asked politely, motioning over to Luffy's bare form. As good as he looks from behind, I think he could do with some covering up. Laughter met her words and the giant complied almost immediately, ripping a scrap of red cloth from the edge of his cloak. She nodded in thanks when he handed it over and quickly made her way over to the gathered group. The raven-haired woman tapped Luffy's shoulder and made sure to keep her eyes locked to his when he turned. For you, she said amusedly, offering up the large red sheet. The boy bowed and slipped the fabric from her hands before quickly wrapping it around his waist. He went to turn to the group conversing at his back, but she stopped him with a sigh and another tap on his shoulder. Just hold still. Ms. Sun tried not to laugh at the pout he shot her, she really did. Keeping her eyes firmly above the belt and working between her small giggles, she unwrapped Luffy so she could re-wrap him. With the very generous amount of fabric she'd been given, first, she dressed his wounds, insignificant as he made them seem. The next bit only took a minute or two and, as soon as she started, she could already tell he was getting tired of her asking to hold here or there while she tied and ripped, but it was worth it in her opinion. The woman pulled her final touch to the makeshift outfit from her jacket and held it up for Luffy to see, smirking at the rolling of his eyes. Seems like it's my turn to tie you up. He lightly protested when she approached, but she muscled her way in and wrapped the rope a few times around his waist, sinking everything tightly in place. She took a step back and twirled her finger to signal the boy to spin. Luffy pouted like a reluctant show dog, but Miss Sun only continued to smile at him, so he reluctantly complied, giving a half-hearted twirl. She seemed back around and he looked down to examine the outfit for himself. It looked kinda like a dress, but manlier? It's called a toga, the raven-haired woman answered when she saw the unvoiced question in his eye. You'd be surprised what you can learn when you spend as much time in libraries as I do." She waved away the teen's confusion and stepped in his direction, pointing to the rest of their group locked in deep conversation. "Looks like the captain might need to go make some decies." "Thanks, Ms. Sun," Luffy exclaimed, wrapping his arm around the taller woman's shoulder. "I really like it." He felt her tighten up in his grasp and thought he'd done something wrong, but, not a moment later, she softened. He smiled brightly at her and the reply was the rolling of her large blue eyes, but, even though she tried to hide it, he didn't miss the small smile that flashed across her lips. "Come on, Casanova," Ms. Sun teased, pulling the younger boy into the group. It was strange, touching so freely, but she couldn't say she didn't enjoy it. "Please, I know she might not die right this second, but I still think it best you take her and leave in search of someone who knows how to help." Luffy shouldered his way in between Zoro and Sanji as Ms. Sun wrapped around to stand by Nami's side, and the boy looked up at his two friends curiously. "What's going on?" "The little girl's sick," Zoro answered under his breath, watching Nami converse with the man who called himself Galdino. "Well, he thinks she's sick. Apparently, he wants us to take her and go look for a doctor." Sanji chimed in. If he had a vote, he was very much in favor. The girl really didn't look so good and he couldn't help but feel like she would love a bowl of soup when she woke up. Luffy mulled over his crew members' words for all but 2 seconds before he stepped into the center of their group. Interrupting the conversation, his navigator was locked in. "Nami, can we leave?" he asked, assuming she knew what he meant by the question. "Well, yeah," the Orangeite admitted, standing from her place crouched by Galdino, "but it's a long shot, Luffy." There was no telling how long it would take them to reach their next destination or whether that place would even have a doctor. The pirate captain shrugged and sent his navigator a smile. "I always like my odds." Without waiting for her reply, he stuck his hand in the air and waved everyone gathered in the direction of the coast. "All right, people, pack it up. It's time to get going." The words sent relief flooding through Mr. Three's system. "Thank you," he exclaimed through unshed tears, grunting when he made to stand once again. "I promise, once I drop her off with you, do whatever you want with me. I don't care." A moment passed and he paled when he realized the deeper meaning to be found in his words. Well, maybe not anything. Luffy looked over his shoulder as they all began to make their way through the forest. "What do you mean? You're coming with us?" He ignored the shocked look the man sent him and cupped his hands around his mouth to address the giants that had begun to follow them, seeing this off or wanting to join. Their deep laughter echoed over the treetops and Dory's voice rang out in reply. "I'm afraid we only come to see you off." However, he couldn't help but shoot a smile over to the giant walking next to him. They'd been given quite the show earlier. As hosts, it would have been rude not to send the group off with something to remember them by. Brogy returned his friend's grin and his thumping heartbeat began to increase in speed, eyes rising to the horizon as a foe long forgotten rose up from the depths of his memory. "And to give a piece of advice before we say goodbye. Levi, Nala, we're gonna be steering the ship for a while," Luffy yelled, catching the sea creature's very bored-looking forms when he broke out onto the beach. Nami had given him the rundown while they'd walked back to the coast. Not that he really remembered most of it. The rumbles that came from the two large animals made him stick his tongue out toward the water. "Well, someone's sick, so deal with it." "What do you want to do with those two?" Nami asked, pointing at the two bodies lying in the shallows. The pirate captain shrugged his shoulders. "Bring them along. The more the merrier," he eventually answered, slowing to a stop when they came upon the people in question. Hopefully they didn't turn out to be too annoying. He bent over and lifted the two soaking forms into the air, small groans leaving each of their mouths. He'd really thought they were unconscious. "The Mary's gonna be crowded," Usopp mused as he stopped next to the rest of the group. He really didn't want to have to swim this time. He'd love a chance to ride with the girls for once. Luffy laughed at the words and threw the practically limp bodies over Levi's back. "I'm sure it'll be fun." He clapped his hands together and waved the girls to board their shuttles. "We'll meet you over there." Usopp futilely reached out to the beasts. Surely he could squeeze on somewhere. Maybe Galdino could carry him too. He sighed and dropped his arm, looking down to the sand in depression when his captain's words sent them on their way. Swimming it was. "All right, everyone, say bye to Dory and Brogy," Luffy exclaimed, turning to give them a big smile. The long-nosed teen turned back as he stepped into the shallow water and bowed to his two role models as deeply as he could. "Thank you for teaching me so much." The two giants laughed and returned all the other waves and shouts before they faced the small one with the long nose. "Go forth and be brave, mighty Usopp. You will reach your goals someday." The sentiment almost brought tears to Usopp's eyes and he turned away before he could show any sort of weakness. Without another word, he dove forward and chased after the quickly shrinking forms of Sanji and Zoro. He would do it. He would become a warrior fit to stand beside them one day. "Even though our time together was short, we shall not forget you, Straw Hat Luffy." Dory bellowed just before said boy made to follow the rest of his friends to his ship, and, if our friendship is true, if you trust us, listen to us now. The pirate captain paused as the distance between him and his companions continued to increase and he turned to look at the massive men curiously. "No matter what." The words rumbled from Brogy's chest like a war drum, "continue to sail forward." For some reason, the statement registered as important, so, Luffy sent the two one last big smile and a thumbs up. "You got it, see ya. Guys. Hope you get off this island soon." With his farewells said and done, he shot out into the sea, already beginning to catch up to those who'd left him behind. Last one, there's a rotten egg. Chapter 57. A Monarch's Return. A small hoof reached out to pluck the last few sprigs of medicinal herbs from the greenhouse, the appendages acting with practiced precision. The early morning light filtered through the frosted glass, casting a soft glow over the vibrant green leaves, and he couldn't help but breathe deeply of the earthy scent that filled the air. This place was his sanctuary, somewhere he could focus solely on the delicate footing between life and death that doctors stood on. The thought sent a pang through the reindeer's chest, but he shook his head and gathered the herbs into a neat bundle, tying them with a piece of string he kept in his coat pocket. Satisfied with his work, he turned to leave, mind already on the next task at hand. As he stepped out into the crisp air, the cold nipping at his fur, Chopper saw someone standing at the castle's entrance looking at him with a hint of impatience. The snowy wind whipped at the old woman's long coat, but she didn't seem to mind, her aged eyes taking in the small creature fondly. He tried to look away bashfully when she caught his gaze, but she wouldn't be letting him squirm away from her. "Come on, brat," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the short distance. "It's time to do our rounds through town." The reindeer quickly nodded his head without a thought of refusal. As much as he respected the elderly woman, she was really scary when she was mad. "Just a second, I need to grab my bag," he replied nervously, already turning to dart back through the large, ornate doors of their home. Before he made it inside, however, something caught his eye and he looked up to the flag fluttering atop the castle's roof. His steps faltered as memories came flooding back, unbidden and sharp, and Chopper just barely kept himself from colliding with the door. He could still see the old doctor's smiling face, the warmth in his eyes as he spoke of his dream for the future, of his dream for him. He clenched his furry eyelids tightly, reaching up to pull his hat down over the top half of his head. Those memories were tainted now, clouded by the knowledge Doctorine had shared with him not 2 weeks ago. It was his fault that Dr. Hiralik was dead. Chopper had always suspected it deep down the more he'd learned about medicine, but hearing the confirmation had struck him harder than he expected. He'd been reckless, too eager to be useful back then, and it had cost a man his life. And not just any man. He froze in place for a moment, eyes glued to the stone floor beneath his hooves, and doubt ate at his stomach. Was he really fit to carry on the old doctor's legacy as he had said? Did he really even deserve to be called a doctor at all after what he'd done? The reindeer glanced back at the elderly woman when she coughed loudly from her place leaning against the sleigh, standing there with her usual stern expression. It was strange being around her after everything they'd shared. She'd been the one that had told him of what he'd done and, yet, she'd also been the one to convince him to keep going, to not give up on the path he had chosen. A small smile began to tug at the corners of his mouth. He really was grateful to her for that. Shaking off the lingering doubts with a slap to his cheeks, Chopper hurried up the stairs, his small legs pumping as he raced to his room. It didn't take long to find his bag as he always kept it ready, just in case, and the brief respite he'd taken during his search had been enough to center himself. He was determined to make Dr. Hiralik proud and become the best doctor he could be. Mind set and bag slung over his shoulder, he dashed back down the stairs and out into the snow-covered courtyard, the cold air biting at his nose. Kureha clicked her teeth in irritation when she saw her student walk back out of the castle, arms crossed as she tapped her foot impatiently. Damn kid was getting stranger by the day, and she knew why. She still wasn't sure she'd made the right decision, but she was too old to let it weigh on her much. The thought made her sigh, but she quickly wiped her tiredness away and replaced it with a half-hearted sneer. "Hurry up, brat," she barked, the front doors creaking when he closed them once again. "I'm coming, Doctorine," Chopper called back, his voice full of new energy as he scampered across the courtyard. He leapt into the sleigh and had to stop himself from giggling at the woman's flustered face as he blurred by. However, just when he thought he'd gotten the best of his mentor, the wooden vehicle jerked forward and his face hit the seat instead of his backside like he'd intended. Kureha cackled like a witch at the childish outrage on her protege's face. "You're too young to be messing with a girl in her late 30s. Chopper righted himself and sat down next to the woman before sending her a questioning look, Hoof holding onto his pink hat as the wind tried to blow it away. "But, Doctorine, you're no. Not another word out of you, or you're retaking every practical test I've ever given you." "Oh my god, we're gonna die." Usopp's panicked scream echoed across the ship, his eyes wide with terror as he tightly gripped Mary's railing. Ignoring the shout, Luffy's laughter filled the air, a carefree sound that didn't match the way his crew members rushed around the deck like chickens with their heads cut off. But, before he could even get a word out, Nami's voice caught his attention, sharp and commanding. "Luffy, steer us out of the way before we get eaten," the Oranget screamed from the deck below, already turning back to the others scrambling around her. She groaned when she caught the large grin taking up the majority of her captain's face. "Someone get on the whipstaff. He's definitely not gonna listen to me." The straw-hatted teen grinned and his grip tightened on the ropes in his hands. "Dory and Brogy told me to go forward no matter what, so, that's what we're doing." Before anyone else present could voice their thoughts on this decidedly reckless plan, two powerful voices echoed across the ocean, causing the entire crew to momentarily forget the gaping maw of the enormous goldfish threatening to swallow them whole. Instead, their eyes turned back to the quickly shrinking island behind them. "Today is the day of your demise, foul beast." Luffy's gaze was filled with anticipation as he watched the two giants pull their weapons back, heart racing with excitement. He stared in wonder when their arms flashed forward and for a moment, everything was silent. "Hikoku sovereignty." The pirate captain stilled in awe as he watched the ocean part, a blue-red shark fin-like light slicing through the sea and leaving a massive watery rift in its wake. His sharp eyes followed the attack as it rushed by the Mary, and he almost completely missed the roiling its passing sent through the waters around the ship. A high-pitched wail accompanied the biggest explosion of light he'd ever seen and, this time, even he couldn't ignore the rocking it sent through his precious vessel. Luffy looked up once again when he balanced himself and his eyes widened at the absence of the monster that had blocked their path only moments ago. That was one of the coolest things he'd ever seen. The thought shocked him back to reality and he almost immediately turned to shout his praise back toward Little Garden. However, he stopped before he could get any words out, a loud thump echoing from the wood in front of him. When he looked closer to see what caused it, he had to rub his eyes to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Was that a cooked chicken? The straw-hatted teen looked up when more thumps began to sound, and when his gaze rose further, he suddenly realized something very surreal. So surreal, in fact, that his brain completely shut down, drool beginning to drip to the wood at his feet. It was raining chickens. Just as Luffy was about to spring forward to intercept several pieces falling from the sky in one go, Nami stepped in front of him, deftly holding more meat on it than was safe to carry. "No need for that, Luffy. I've got your meal right here," she said saucily, placing the veritable feast down before him. The pirate captain's mouth watered as he reached for the delicious spread, but, before he could grab it, a hand sprouted from his shoulder, gently turning his head to the side. Confused, he found himself staring into the large blue eyes of Miss Sun as she wore a chicken suit. And not just any chicken suit. Luffy began to salivate, his mind swirling with confusion and hunger as more arms sprouted from his body, each one holding a piece of fried chicken in its hand. He glanced back at Nami, only to find that the rest of the crew had appeared beside her, every one of them donning chicken suits while they surrounded him slowly. Guys," Luffy chuckled nervously. He blinked and his friends' faces disappeared, leaving them as, talking cooked chickens. Just what the hell was happening? And why was he so hungry? Torn between the surreal nature of the situation and the irresistible aromas of what he could have sworn were his friends, the boy tried to keep himself from lashing out. However, his hunger grew as the chickens' voices rose, urging him to eat them, and his resolve was beginning to crumble. Surely just a bite wouldn't hurt, right? The door suddenly creaked open and Miss Sun almost dropped her small cup of tea in alarm, a sigh of relief leaving her when she glanced up to see Luffy entering. She carefully set down her mug before marking her place in her book. "What brings you to the galley at such an hour?" she asked, setting the reading material down by her cup and shooting him an inquisitive glance. Wasn't he supposed to be steering the ship? Her eyes narrowed slightly as the boy began to mumble to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, guys, stop it. I can't eat my friends." Miss Sun raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued as she watched him open the fridge, rummaging through its contents while licking his lips. The teen hadn't even the mind to wipe the drool from his chin as he unconsciously reached into what was probably a treasure chest to him. "Even though you all look super tasty." A soft chuckle escaped the raven-haired woman's mouth as she stood up and approached the seemingly sleeping figure, her hand reaching out to tap him on the shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, Luffy jolted, his eyes snapping open, the whites fading as his pupils returned to focus. He blinked rapidly, glancing between M's Sun and the fridge, before snagging one last item of food from inside and closing the door with a satisfied grin. "What are you doing up?" the boy asked, the words muffled slightly as he chewed on a particularly tasty piece of chicken. "I could ask the same of you," Miss Sun replied with another chuckle. Luffy shrugged at the words before making to sit down at the small table to enjoy his late-night snack. "Levi and Nala are resting, so I took a nap too. Must have gotten hungry," he replied through a mouthful of meat. Her chuckle turned into a full-blown fit of laughs and it took Miss Sun a moment to gather her thoughts before she sighed softly, nodding back to the book resting no more than an arm's length from the boy. "Late night reading for me." The answer seemed to satisfy the other occupant of the room, but it wasn't completely the truth. She'd also been thinking about Marianne. The girl had been so adamant that she was a teenager, not a little girl, but these days, she looked so small, frail even. The time she spent out of bed had begun to dwindle the further they got from Little Garden. She'd woken up relatively well the day after they'd left and had made quite the fuss, but once Galdino had calmed her down, her energy had begun to steadily fade. That was another thing that weighed on her mind. Having her co-workers on board the Mary was a strange experience. No one seemed to recognize who she was, given that everyone called her Ms. Sun and she had never met any of them in person. That didn't keep the atmosphere from being tense most days, with Luffy too busy to break the awkward tension between the outsiders. Yet, the Straw Hat Pirates themselves seemed nonplussed by it all, going about their daily routines as if the awkwardness was just another detail in their unpredictable lives. The woman's was shaken out of her thoughts when Luffy spoke again, a loud burp leaving his mouth as he rubbed his belly happily. "Alright. Well, I'm gonna go see if Nala and Levi are awake." The pirate captain stood and began to make his way toward the door, pulling out the eternal pose that led to saloon. His gaze fixated on it for a moment before rising and he shot the woman he was speaking to a tired grunt. "I hope we're close. 'Cause I don't know how much longer she's gonna make it." Miss Sun hesitated for a moment before speaking, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "Why is it you agreed to this in the first place?" She realized the question might have come off as insensitive, especially if Galdino or Marianne had been around, but she hadn't had the chance to ask before now and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Luffy sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed out of place for him, and another small pause entered the flow of conversation. "I guess I'm just not a huge fan of kids dying." A sad smile crossed his face as thoughts of Sabo rose to the forefront of his mind and he laughed ruefully, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "Someone I really care about died when we were both young." The admission froze Ms. Sun in place, shock rippling through her figure. She hadn't expected such a personal confession. It was strange seeing him so pensive and she couldn't help but feel as if the look didn't really suit him. She shook her head and sent an apologetic look his way. "I'm sorry. I didn't kn." Before she could finish, bright laughter filled the room, and she was relieved to see a large smile on his face once again. "It's alright. Miss Sun, I think you would have loved me talking about him. He was a huge show-off." Luffy admitted, small chuckles rumbling from his chest as he turned back toward the exit. He looked down and opened his hand, gazing at his palm while memories of his older brother continued to swirl through his mind. "I still miss him a ton," he said lightly, flashing Miss Sun one last big smile before he made his way through the door, "but he's still with me in a lot of ways." The words stunned the woman into silence, the short conversation ending with the door softly shutting at Luffy's back, and it took a long moment of staring at its gnarled wood before she could bring herself out of her stupor. She hadn't known it at the time, but she'd been more right than she knew. Nami really didn't give these boys enough credit. As the sleigh glided to a halt at the edge of the village, Chopper couldn't help but shiver at the soft crunch of snow beneath the runners being the only sound in the eerie stillness. The wooden shuttle slowed to a stop and he sent the old woman at his side a nervous glance. It was strange to see the town empty. Their visits weren't regular, so he didn't think people would be expecting them, but there was no one to be seen anywhere. Kureha and her protégé disembarked, their breath visible in the cold air as they glanced around, taking in the strange, empty state of the streets. The usual bustling activity was nowhere to be found. The sight struck her as odd. She thought at least Dalton would be around. Chopper frowned, his hooves crunching lightly in the snow as he adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder. "Where is everyone?" he murmured, more to himself than to the woman at his side. The more he looked, the more the village felt like a ghost town, abandoned and silent. He glanced up at Doctorine, hoping she might have an answer, but instead of the usual smirk or gruff remark, she only gave him a soft pat on the top of his head, her expression unusually serious. "Stay close, Chopper," Kureha said, "Voice-a-method ain't right." No sooner had the words left her mouth than the distant sound of commotion reached their ears, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the port. She sent her student a quick, steely look before they began moving, cautiously making their way toward the noise. As they walked, the unease in the little reindeer's chest grew. The streets were empty, devoid of the familiar faces he had come to know. Not even the usual stray animals that roamed the alleys were anywhere to be seen. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the growing sound of activity ahead. It wasn't long before they saw the back of a large crowd gathered at the docks, the people packed tightly together with their heads all turned towards something he couldn't quite see. "I won't let you have your way with this place, Wapple." The voice had Kureha straining to get a look over the top of the crowd, and when she caught a glimpse at the area the townspeople were gathered around, a small gasp left her lips. "Is everything okay, Doctorine?" Chopper asked nervously, having not quite caught the loud words due to the murmurings of the larger bodies in front of him. All he knew was that something was making everybody really agitated. "Ignore the traitor, subjects. Your king has officially returned." The older woman ignored the yelp that came from the reindeer's mouth and pulled him into the sea of bodies, scowling to herself at the realization of what was going on. The fat prince had returned, and, by the look of things, Dalton had tried to send him and his loyal followers packing. However, even with that nifty devil fruit of his, it seemed he'd been outmatched. "Listen closely, Chopper," Kureha whispered over her shoulder, hoping the words would reach him through the crowd. "I've got a plan." She stopped and bent down to the ground, ignoring the few curious looks the action garnered as she faced her student. "But, I need you to make it happen." The man named Dalton stumbled when he tried to stand back up, the numerous onlookers gasping at the wounds he'd sustained. He couldn't blame them either. He snapped off the ends of 2 arrows sticking out of his shoulder and ripped them both out with a grunt. "I'm afraid you're going to have to kill me if you want to come back to Drum after leaving the way you did," he said through a bloody cough. Dalton somehow made it to his feet and steadied himself as best he could, a grunt of annoyance leaving his lips at the state of Wapol's right-hand man. Kuromarimo lay on the ground groaning, a multitude of doctors working to sew up the large hole he'd put through the middle of him. His eyes shifted to Chess and he saw a similar sight much to his chagrin. "Oh, why don't you just shut up and die already then?" Wapol yelled, making to approach the bloodied man. He scowled at his 2 subordinates for making him work by losing. But, at least they'd had the decency to soften the ox up for him. This was surely going to be delightfully easy. And, once this little obstacle was out of the way, there would be nothing stopping him from taking his castle back. From taking his armory back. The ex-king stopped in front of Dalton and wasted no time in opening his mouth as wide as he could, almost unable to resist laughing at the bleeding arm his target threw up in defense. Just before his jaws went to close, however, a voice rang out from the crowd. "So, the Fat Prince has graced us with his presence once more. What a wonderful surprise." The words cut through the tense air like a knife, and the large man froze, his wide maw hanging open as his fiery gaze scanned the crowd. With a snarl, he shoved Dalton to the ground, snapping his mouth shut with a resounding click, and marched toward the gathered villagers. "Who the hell said that?" he roared, his voice shaking with fury at the thought that one of these pitiful ants dared insult him. "I'm a king, not a prince." The crowd parted fearfully, revealing the smirking face of an old crone standing defiantly in his path, and it made Wapol seethe. She was just an old woman, insignificant and weak, and she dared insult him, her king. He bared his teeth and stomped his way toward her, his massive form casting a shadow over her diminutive figure. But before the ex-king could reach out and wrap his meaty hand around the old woman's throat, the air was filled with a powerful shout. "Heavy point." The voice echoed through the stillness, and a gasp rippled through the crowd, making Wapol stop in his tracks once again as he whipped back around to see what had caused the sudden stir among the onlookers. Chopper, now in his towering heavy point form, gathered up Dalton's bruised and bloodied body, throwing him over his broad shoulder. Without a moment's hesitation, he sprinted directly at the man in the center of his path, his eyes blazing with determination. The sight of the monster barreling toward him caused Wapol to panic and his mouth flew open wide in defense, but it blinded him to the creature's real intentions. As he dashed forward, townspeople beginning to scramble in panic, the reindeer human glanced down at Dalton and offered an apologetic smile. There was no time for gentleness. Then, with a powerful swing, he launched him high into the air, the former royal guardsman rocketing skyward. Just as Dalton sailed over Wapol's gaping jaws, Chopper's eyes shifted to the ground, brainpoint. His massive frame shrank as he shifted into his smaller, more agile form, and his body slid just underneath a row of massive teeth. Before his opponent could even register what happened, he transformed again with a roar that sounded more squeaky than probably intended. Jump point. The ground cracked beneath the reindeer's hooves as he shot into the air, his body twisting as he prepared for his next move, guard point. Chopper's form suddenly expanded into a massive ball of fur, and the added weight was just enough to slow his momentum, so he was in the right place to catch Dalton's fall. The man bounced off of his cushioned back and he rotated even further. Heavy point. The shift came just in time for him to open his arms and wrap them around Dalton's descending form before the two of them could hit the ground. The two impacted with a thud and Chopper winced as his back slammed into the earth, softly rolling the bleeding figure off to the side as he turned his gaze back to where he'd left Doctorine. His heart lurched when he saw her sprinting toward him, her elderly body moving as fast as it could in his direction. Without a moment's hesitation, Chopper switched back to jump point and his powerful legs propelled him forward with a crack. He blew by in a blur, but, as he neared Wapol, the ex-king's jaws snapped open once more, forcing Chopper to veer off course to avoid the crushing teeth. His hooves skidded across the concrete when he landed and he spun around, hoping he'd grab the man's attention. When he looked past his opponent now stalking in his direction, the reindeer caught his mentor kneeling beside Dalton, her hands working quickly to tend to his injuries. The sight made his mind race. He assumed Doctorine was trying to heal the man, just as the other doctors were doing with Wapol's two subordinates. If that was the case, he needed to buy her time. Arm point, he roared. With a determined grunt, Chopper dashed toward his opponent just as the man swallowed a huge chunk of the concrete taken from the ground at his feet. His bulky arm shot forward and he was surprised when his hoof connected with something far more solid than skin, the impact reverberating through his body. As he looked up, he saw cracks spreading from where his hoof was buried. Was that rock? Wapol jumped back, a look of shock and rage on his face as he examined the massive amount of cracking stone falling from his chest. What kind of monster are you, punching through concrete like that? Before Chopper could answer, the doctors working on Wapol's subordinates finished their work and, though the two men weren't in perfect health, they were joined the fight. The reindeer gulped at the realization that he would soon be outnumbered but ultimately kept himself from retreating, eyes shifting back to his primary opponent. As powerful as his various forms were, he didn't really know how to fight. He was more of a healer, after all. Throwing punches was pretty much the extent of what he could do, and even then, he wasn't sure he was any good at it. if he had to take on 3 opponents at once. As if on cue, Kuromarimo's boxing glove flashed out and Chess loosed a flaming arrow from his bow, Chopper's hoofed feet freezing in indecision. However, just as the attacks were about to reach him, a loud roar split the air and an ox barreled into the fray. His eyes widened, but he wasted no time in watching the large animal any further, turning back toward the fat man now barreling in his direction and throwing his arms up in a hasty block. Dalton let out a bellow of pain as an explosion of fire rocked his side and he just barely managed to stay upright, quickly straightening himself out to charge. Kureha had warned him of pushing himself too far after tending to the wounds he'd already sustained, but he couldn't run. Not while someone was fighting in his place. He at least had to help. Chopper tried to focus in on how the Oxman was faring, but his attention was quickly pulled back to Wapol, his massive concrete-covered hand crashing down toward him. "Brainpoint!" he yelled, before the ex-king's fist could connect with him. He shrunk to his normal size in a poof and the large man's arm crashed through the space he'd occupied only moments ago. After only one step forward, he tensed and flexed his devil fruit powers once again, Hornpoint. Wapol groaned when he felt the concrete protecting his stomach violently shatter, spittle and blood leaving his mouth as he shot backward. A loud crack echoed over the port when his back collided with the side of a house and his body disappeared inside, smoke and dust concealing the whole. Just as the reindeer landed, his transformation abruptly ended and he reverted to his original form, body bouncing off the ground when he crashed into it. He'd barely given himself time to catch his breath before he reached into his bag and pulled out another rumble ball. He knew the consequences of taking a second one so soon, but he had no choice. From the sound of shifting debris and groaning entering his sensitive ears, he could tell the fight wasn't over yet. Chopper slowly pulled himself back to his feet and managed to catch Doctorine's eye. It was obvious from the worried look the woman sent him that she could tell what he was going to do. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep fighting, for Dalton's sake. What his mentor had said earlier had been true. The Kingdom of Drum couldn't afford to lose him. With a determined nod, the reindeer popped the yellow ball into his mouth and bit down, the crunch of the hard shell echoing through the air. Rumble. His determined gaze met Wapol's as the man pulled himself out of the building he'd sent him into and he grit his small teeth. Jump point. A mound of fur sprouted around him at the words, frustration flaring in his chest at it being the wrong transformation, but he quickly pushed it aside and focused. With a deep breath, he flexed his body once again, arm point. Chopper's eyes locked onto Wapol as the power in his words took effect, arms ballooning and body growing in response to his will. Taking one last glance at Dalton just barely holding his own against Kuromarimo in chess, he curled into himself before shooting in his opponent's direction, determined to protect the future of Drum Island. Galdino sat by Marianne's side, his brows furrowed in worry as he carefully exchanged the soiled cloth on her forehead for a fresh one from the bowl of cool water at his side. The damp fabric slipped from his fingers as he turned back to rinse it, his mind lost in the anxious routine of caring for the girl. "Damn, I feel like shit." Marianne's voice croaked out, breaking the silence of the room. Her eyes blinked sluggishly as she shifted in her bed, trying to find a more comfortable position. Mr. 3 almost dropped the cloth in surprise, but he quickly recovered, turning to her with a stern look. "That is not language fitting of a lady." He scolded, though the concern in his eyes softened the rebuke. He stood, grabbing a cup from the table and filling it with water from the pitcher the chef of the ship had thoughtfully refilled earlier. Once it was full, he made his way back to the chair beside her bed, sitting down with a grunt. The girl scowled at him, her mouth curling downward in a frown. "I feel like death, gal. I think my language is justified." She reached out with a trembling hand to take the cup from him. A pained smirk replacing the downturn of her lips. "Or maybe our shipmates are just rubbing off on me." Galdino scoffed, holding the glass of water steady in her hand and helping her take a sip before setting it gently on the table beside her bed. He turned back, his eyes scanning her frail form, and he couldn't suppress the deep sigh that escaped him. He knew she wouldn't be awake for long. The intervals between her periods of wakefulness had grown shorter as they sailed, and he couldn't shake the growing fear that the day she didn't wake up at all was approaching faster with each one that passed. The man's hands clenched into fists, frustration and helplessness boiling within him. But before his thoughts could spiral further into despair, a small, clammy palms stopped them in their tracks. Marianne opened her mouth to speak, but just as she did, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the stairs and Ms. Valentine appeared. The blonde's eyes immediately lit up when she saw that Marianne was awake, and she rushed over to the bed, stopping gently at its foot. "Hey there, Marianne," she greeted with a soft smile. "How y'all feelin'?" The annoyed look sent her way was answer enough, and she winced slightly. "Yeah, probably should have figured." Despite the depressing aura in the air, Ms. Valentine offered a reassuring smile, her tone softening. "I'm sure you'll be back on your feet before you know it." There was no response from the recipient of the words, but she noticed that the girl's breathing began to settle into a calmer rhythm. Sensing the need for a change in topic, and getting back to what she'd gone down there to do originally, she continued, "I'm gonna take Galdino upstairs real key." "Land ho," the blonde girl sighed, already knowing what was coming. "To talk about that," she began, seeing the anticipation growing in the room's other occupants. Galdino opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, she beat him to it, firmly nodding toward the stairs. "Go. I'll stay with Marianne while you see for yourself." A fit of chuckles started to rise from Marianne's chest, but they were quickly overtaken by a harsh coughing fit. Mr. 3 and Ms. Valentine both moving to help. However, she waved them off with a shaky hand. I'm fine, she croaked out, her voice rough but determined. She looked up at Galdino, a weak but defiant smile on her lips. "Go up there and bring me some good news. Plus, you really need some sun." The waxman hesitated for a moment, but the words seemed to register. With a semi-reluctant nod, he stood up and turned toward the stairs. "Fine. But yell if you need anything," he said, giving Ms. Valentine a nod of thanks before heading up to the storage room. Just before he left, he called back over his shoulder, "And don't think I didn't hear that just because I ignored it." The sound of Marianne's laughter, though weak, followed Galdino up the stairs, bringing a small smile to his face as he pushed forward and made his way through the storage room's entrance. As soon as he emerged outdoors, the bustling activity on the deck hit him as well as the cold, frigid air. He bundled into his jacket and let his eyes roam about while stepping in the direction of the side railing. Everyone was in full preparatio, carrying over the sound of crunching footsteps as she barked out orders. It seemed they were prepping to dock. The thought got Mr. 3's feet moving even faster, and he quickly made his way across the space, careful to avoid getting caught up in the preparations, much to the navigator's annoyance. When he finally reached the wooden rail, his sight locked onto the distant island they were headed toward, desperately hoping that one of its inhabitants could help his partner. However, just as that hope began to take root in the man's chest, a monstrous roar reverberated through the air, shaking the Mary and sending a jolt of shock through the current occupants of the deck. He instinctively covered his ears at the sound, and his eyes snapped wide open in shock. The port he'd just been staring at in the distance was now dominated by a massive, brown humanoid figure. The creature looming over the landscape with a shadow even larger than those of the giants they'd encountered on Little Garden. "What the hell is that?" Galdino muttered in disbelief, another roar rolling over the vessel. He resisted the urge to turn and scowl at the captain of the ship when his excited laughter burst into the air, and kept his gaze trained on the massive creature, heart pounding in his chest as they drew closer to the island. Whatever that thing was, it was no doctor.